Johnny Cash walked off the stage at San Quentin State Prison, and the roar followed him down the concrete hallway. 2,000 inmates on their feet, voices echoing off steel and stone, the kind of sound that didn't happen anywhere else. Cash's shirt was soaked through, his hands were shaking. He'd just finished the performance of his life. Backstage was a narrow holding area with cinder block walls and fluorescent lights. A guard stood by the door, arms crossed, watching everything. June Carter was sitting on a metal folding chair, fanning herself with a set list. The band was packing up equipment, and standing near the back wall, still in prison blues, was Merle Haggard. Merle was 29 years old. He'd been locked up in San Quentin for 2 years, serving time for attempted burglary. He played guitar in the prison band. He wrote songs on scraps of paper he kept hidden in his cell. And 15 minutes earlier, he'd stood on that stage and watched Johnny Cash perform for men who looked just like him. Cash saw Merle and walked over, still catching his breath. "Merle," he said, extending his hand. "Hell of a crowd." Merle shook his hand. "Yes, sir. I heard you've been writing. Some of the guys told me you got real talent. I do what I can." Cash pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. "These men, they don't forget. I mentioned your name earlier and half the yard started yelling. They remember your songs." Merle nodded slowly, didn't say anything. Cash leaned against the wall, still riding the adrenaline. "You know what gets me? Every time I come here, I think I understand what it's like, what these men go through, the isolation, the hopelessness. But then I see their faces and I realize I'm only scratching the surface." Merle looked at him for a long moment. His expression was hard to read. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You don't understand what it's like, John." Cash turned to him. "I know I don't fully—" "No." Merle's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that made Cash stop talking. "You don't understand at all, and you never will." The guard by the door shifted his weight, but didn't move. Merle looked down at his hands, then back up at Cash. "You walk in here with your guitar and your band. You play for an hour, maybe 2. The men love it. They cheer. They feel something they haven't felt in years. And then you leave." Cash didn't respond. "You go back to your hotel. You eat a meal that doesn't come from a tin tray. You sleep in a bed that doesn't have bars over it. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and drive away from this place, and it'll be a memory for you. Something you did. Something meaningful." Merle's voice was quiet, but every word landed like a stone. "But for us, this isn't a memory. This is our life, every day, every night. We don't get to leave." Cash stood there, not moving. "You think you understand what it's like in here because you sing about it, because you write songs about prisons and pain and men who made mistakes. But you were never one of us, John. You were never locked in a cell wondering if anyone on the outside remembered your name. You were never told when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak." The room was completely silent now. June had stopped fanning herself. The band had stopped packing. Even the guard was listening. "You come here and you tell these men you understand them," Merle said. "But you don't. You can't. Because at the end of the day, you get to be Johnny Cash, and we're just numbers." At the time, no one in that room knew what Cash would say next. Cash stood there for 30 seconds without moving. His face was unreadable. He didn't try to interrupt. He didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, absorbing every word Merle had said. June started to stand up, but Cash held up his hand slightly, signaling her to stay where she was. The silence stretched. The guard by the door looked uncomfortable. One of the band members coughed, but Cash just stood there, looking at Merle. Finally, Cash spoke. His voice was quieter than it had been all night. "You're right." Merle blinked. "You're absolutely right," Cash said again. "I don't understand what it's like. I never have. I come here, I play, I leave, and you stay." Cash looked down at the floor, then back up at Merle. "I've spent years singing about prisons, about men behind bars, about what it does to a person to be locked away from the world, and I thought that mattered. I thought that by singing about it, I was helping people see what happens in places like this." He paused. "But you're right. I was never one of you. I got to walk out of here every time, and that's a difference I can't ever close." The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. "But that doesn't mean I should stop listening." Cash's expression shifted slightly. "I don't claim to understand what you've lived. I don't claim to know what it feels like to wake up in a cell every morning or to wonder if the world's forgotten about you. But I do know that your story matters. And if I can stand on a stage and make sure people on the outside hear it, even if I'm just the messenger, then I'm going to keep doing that." Cash's voice was steady now, calm. "I'm not trying to be you, Merle. I'm not trying to take your place or speak for you. I'm just trying to make sure that when you do get out of here, people are ready to listen. Because you've got something to say that I never could." Merle stared at him. He opened his mouth like he was going to respond, then closed it again. What looked like a confrontation would later be remembered differently. The guard by the door cleared his throat. "Mr. Cash, we need to move you out in 5 minutes." Cash nodded but didn't look away from Merle. "When do you get out?" 6 months, Merle said quietly, "if I stay clean." "You will. You don't know that." "No," said Cash, "I don't. But I've heard your songs, and anyone who can write like that has something worth staying clean for." Merle looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred from years of work and mistakes. "They're not going to care about my songs out there, not from an ex-con. They will if someone gives you a shot. And who's going to do that?" Cash pulled a card from his wallet and handed it to Merle. It had a phone number written on it in pen. "When you get out, call this number. Ask for Saul Holliff. He's my manager. Tell him I told you to call." Merle looked at the card, then at Cash. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're right about everything you said. I'm not one of you, but that doesn't mean I can't help." Merle held the card but didn't say anything. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you." The guard stepped forward. "Mr. Cash, time's up." Cash nodded. He looked at Merle one more time. "I meant what I said. Your story matters. Don't let this place convince you otherwise." Merle watched as Cash walked toward the door. June stood up and followed, along with the band. The guard escorted them down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. Merle stood there alone in the empty room, holding the card with the phone number on it. He stayed there for a long time. 6 months later, Merle Haggard walked out of San Quentin State Prison. He had $17 in his pocket, a duffel bag with his belongings, and Johnny Cash's manager's phone number folded in his wallet. He didn't call right away. He got a job washing dishes. He played guitar at a bar in Bakersfield for tips. He wrote songs and tried to figure out if anyone outside of prison would care what an ex-con had to say. 3 months after his release, Merle was playing at a dive bar when someone in the crowd recognized one of his songs from San Quentin. The man came up after the set and asked if Merle had ever thought about recording. Merle said he didn't have the money or the connections. The man said, "Then you better make some." That night, Merle went back to his apartment and pulled out the card Johnny Cash had given him. He stared at it for 20 minutes. Then he picked up the phone. Saul Holliff answered on the third ring. "This is Merle Haggard," Merle said. "Johnny Cash told me to call." There was a pause on the other end. Then Saul said, "He mentioned you might. Where are you?" "Bakersfield." "Can you be in Nashville in 2 weeks?" Merle looked around his one-room apartment. He had maybe $200 to his name. "I don't know if—" "I'll wire you money for a bus ticket," Saul said. "Johnny wants to hear what you've been working on." 2 weeks later, Merle Haggard stood in a recording studio in Nashville. Johnny Cash was sitting on a stool with his guitar, listening as Merle played a song he'd written called Mama Tried. When Merle finished, Cash didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at Saul and said, "Get him a session, full band. I want this recorded." Merle shook his head. "I can't pay for—" "You're not paying for anything," Cash said. "This is what I told you in San Quentin. I'm not one of you, but I can open doors. What you do after you walk through them is up to you." Mama Tried was recorded 3 weeks later. It wasn't an immediate hit, but it got airplay. People heard it, and they wanted to hear more. Over the next 2 years, Merle Haggard released a string of songs that would define outlaw country. Sing Me Back Home, The Fugitive, Hungry Eyes. Songs written by a man who'd lived what he sang about. Songs that didn't romanticize prison or crime, but told the truth about what it cost. And every time someone asked Merle how he got his start, he told them the same thing. "Johnny Cash gave me a shot when nobody else would." But he always added something else. He didn't try to be me. He didn't try to tell my story. He just made sure people were ready to listen when I told it myself. In 1970, Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash performed together at the Civic Auditorium in Bakersfield. It was the first time they'd been on stage together since San Quentin. Backstage before the show, Merle found Cash in his dressing room. "John," Merle said, "I need to tell you something." Cash looked up. "What's that?" "That night at San Quentin, I said some things to you, hard things." "You did." "I've thought about that conversation a lot over the last 2 years, and I wanted you to know something." Cash waited. "You were right," Merle said. "You weren't one of us, but that didn't mean you didn't care, and it didn't mean you shouldn't have been there." Cash stood up. "Merle."
"Let me finish," Merle said. "I was angry that night. Angry at the system. Angry at myself. Angry at everyone who got to leave when I had to stay. And I took some of that out on you." He paused. "But you didn't fight me. You didn't defend yourself. You just listened. And then you helped me anyway." Cash looked at him. "You earned everything you have, Merle. I just opened a door." "Maybe," Merle said, "but you didn't have to. You could have written me off as another angry con, but you didn't. You heard what I was really saying." "And what were you really saying?" Merle thought about it. "I was saying I was scared. Scared that nobody would care about my music. Scared that my story didn't matter because I'd been locked up. Scared that I'd never be more than a number." He looked at Cash. "And you made sure I was wrong." Cash extended his hand. Merle shook it. "Your story mattered before I showed up," Cash said. "I just made sure more people heard it." They performed together that night. Johnny Cash opened with his prison songs. Merle followed with his. And when they stood on stage together at the end, singing a duet neither of them had rehearsed, 2,000 people in Bakersfield understood they were watching something rare. Two men, two completely different lives, but the same truth, that stories matter, no matter where they come from. Years later, a journalist asked Merle Haggard about that night at San Quentin, about what he'd said to Johnny Cash backstage. Merle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told him he wasn't one of us, and I was right. But that wasn't the point." The journalist asked what the point was. "The point was that Johnny never pretended to be one of us. He never claimed he'd been through what we'd been through. He just made sure people remembered we existed. And when I got out, he made sure people were ready to hear what I had to say." The journalist asked if Merle regretted what he'd said. "No," Merle said, "because it was true, and Johnny needed to hear it. But what mattered more was what he did after I said it." "What did he do?" Merle smiled slightly. "He listened, and then he helped anyway." That conversation at San Quentin became one of those stories people tell when they talk about Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard. Some versions say they argued. Others say Cash walked away angry. A few claim Merle apologized immediately. None of those versions are true. The truth is simpler.
Merle Haggard told Johnny Cash something hard and true. Cash absorbed it without defending himself, and then he did exactly what he'd always done. He made sure people heard the voices that mattered most.
The difference between them was real. Cash had never been locked up. He'd never lived the life he sang about. But he understood something that most people miss, that you don't have to live someone's story to help them tell it. Merle Haggard lived his story. Johnny Cash made sure the world heard it. And in the end, that was enough. Because some people are meant to tell their own stories, and some people are meant to make sure those stories get told. Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard understood which role they each played, and that understanding, born in a concrete room at San Quentin State Prison, changed country music forever. Not because one man was better than the other, but because both men knew the difference between living something and listening to it, and both mattered.